A rancher bought a rejected mail-order bride with a sack on her head. He was shocked when he saw. The church bell tolls as dust blows across the street. Townsfolk laugh, pointing at the silent figure forced onto the platform, her face hidden beneath rough burlap. No man would claim her until one rancher stepped forward, silver in hand, and took her away. But when he pulls off the sack, the truth strikes harder than a gunshot. She's scarred, broken in body and heart, yet carrying a secret that powerful men would kill to bury. Soon, whispers of shame spread through town. Barns go up in flames, and a frightened orphan seeks refuge at their door. What she holds in her hands isn't just old letters, dips the key to land, water, and survival. Now, one rancher must decide if he'll stand against the cattle baron who owns the town, or lose everything he's ever fought for. She was the bride nobody wanted. He was the man who swore to protect her. But can love and faith survive when the whole frontier turns against them? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. The afternoon sun beat down on the dusty streets of Miller's Junction as the train whistle's echo faded into the Colorado mountains. Caleb Boone shifted his weight, boot heel scuffing against the wooden platform as he waited to collect his monthly seed order. The late summer heat had drawn beads of sweat beneath his weathered hat brim. But something else entirely made him uncomfortable today. A cluster of townsfolk had gathered near the station's loading dock, their excited murmurs carrying across the yard, through the gaps between shoulders and Sunday-best dresses. Caleb caught glimpses of what held their attention. A woman standing silent and still as a fence post, with a crude burlap sack covering her head and face. "Step right up, folks." Harrison Mills, the postmaster, called out with the practiced charm of a circus barker. "Feast your eyes on our special delivery, one mail-order bride, slightly damaged goods." A few rough-looking men flanking him guffawed, elbowing each other as Mills continued his performance. Caleb's jaw tightened. He'd known Harrison Mills for 15 years, watched the man's meanness grow like bindweed after his wife left him. But this was a new low, even for him. Seems her intended took one look and decided he'd rather keep bachelor cooking. Mills announced, drawing more laughter from the growing crowd. "But waste not, want not who'll offer a fair price for a spoiled bride nobody wants." The woman's shoulders tensed beneath her plain brown dress, but she remained statue still. Something about her dignity in the face of such cruelty stirred memories Caleb thought he'd buried years ago of Sarah, his late wife, and how she'd faced her final fever with that same quiet strength. "I've got to bits," called out Tom Wesley, the livery stable hand, jingling coins in his palm. "For bits here," countered another voice. Mills grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Now we're getting somewhere, folks. Who'll give me 6? The crowd pressed closer, caught up in the ugly sport of it. A few children darted between adults' legs to get a better look, pointing and giggling. The woman's hands, clasped tightly at her waist, began to tremble. Caleb had seen enough. His boots struck the wooden planks with purpose as he strode forward, crowd parting before his approach. At 6 feet tall, with shoulders broadened by years of ranch work, he cut an imposing figure, even without the thundercloud expression he wore now. "This ends here, Mills," he said, voice quiet but carrying clearly in the sudden hush. The postmaster's smile turned sharp. "Well, if it ain't our own hermit rancher come down from his mountain. You taking an interest in matrimony again, Boone?" Caleb ignored the jab, reaching into his vest pocket. The silver dollars he'd brought for seeds clattered onto the loading dock. "I'm taking her. That's more than fair price for a train ticket." "Now hold on," Mills protested, though his eyes fixed greedily on the silver. "This here's just a bit of fun. Fun's over." Caleb stepped closer, letting his voice drop lower. "Unless you'd like to explain to the marshal how you're running an illegal slave auction on federal property." Color drained from Mill's face. He snatched up the coins, trying to cover his retreat with a forced laugh. "Have it your way, Boone. She's your problem now." The crowd began dispersing. Entertainment concluded, though several lingered to whisper behind raised hands. Caleb paid them no mind, turning instead to the woman who stood trembling but unbowed. "Ma'am," he said softly, "my wagon's just over yonder. Would you allow me to help you aboard? You'll be safe at my ranch until we can sort this proper." She nodded once, sharp and brief, as Caleb guided her with the barest touch to her elbow. He could feel the tension thrumming through her like a plucked guitar string. They walked in silence past the gawking remnants of the crowd, her steps careful and measured despite her blindfolded state. His wagon waited, in the shade of the general store's awning, the team of bay horses dozing in their traces. Caleb kept his movements slow and telegraphed as he helped her up onto the wooden seat, ensuring her skirts were clear of the wheels. "I know you've no cause to trust any stranger's word just now," he said, once she was settled. "But I give you my solemn oath, no harm will come to you under my roof." The burlap shifted slightly as she turned her covered face toward him. After a long moment, she gave another of those sharp nods. Townsfolk still lingered on the station platform, murmuring among themselves as Caleb climbed up beside her and took up the reins. He heard fragments of their speculation floating on the hot afternoon air. Double quotes, ... mad as a desert hare. Taking in strays like that, ... double quotes, ... asking for trouble. Mark my words, ... oc. Wonder what's under that sack, that's scared? Off ... Caleb clicked his tongue and the team stirred to life. Wagon wheels crunching through the hard-packed dirt of Miller's Junction's Main Street. The woman sat rigid beside him, hands folded in her lap, as the town began to fall away behind them. Only when they'd passed the last outlying buildings did some of the stiffness ease from her shoulders. The road wound up into the foothills, sagebrush and scattered pines replacing the false-fronted buildings. Dust kicked up by the horses' hooves caught the slanting afternoon light, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark trilled. It was a familiar journey Caleb had made hundreds of times. But today felt different, like the first page of a story he couldn't yet read. He snuck a glance at his silent passenger, noting how she'd tilted her covered face toward the warm breeze coming down from the mountains. Whatever circumstances had led her here, whatever waited beneath that cruel hood, he knew he'd done right by stepping in. His mama had raised him to stand against meanness, and Sarah would have expected no less of him. The wagon rolled on toward his ranch, each turn of the wheels carrying them further from the ugly scene at the station. Caleb held his peace, letting the rhythm of hooves and the creak of leather fill the space between them. There would be time enough for questions later. For now, it was enough to know he'd kept one soul from suffering at the hands of small-town cruelty. The sun slipped lower toward the western peaks, painting the clouds in shades of rose and gold. Another mile would bring them to his gate, and whatever tomorrow might bring would wait until then. For now, there was just the road home, the gathering dusk, and the promise of sanctuary he'd made to a stranger in need. The wagon wheels creaked steadily as Caleb guided his team along the winding trail. Evening shadows stretched longer across the land, painting the Colorado foothills in deepening shades of purple and gold. Beside him, the woman sat straight-backed and still, though her hands trembled in her lap like aspen leaves in an autumn breeze. The burlap sack still covered her head, a sight that made Caleb's chest tighten with anger at Mills and the others who'd treated her like less than human. He'd held his tongue for the first mile, letting the rhythm of the horse's hooves fill the silence. But now he felt moved to speak. "Ma'am," he said softly, careful to keep his voice gentle as addressing a spooked colt, "I reckon you've had more than your share of folks passing judgment today. Want you to know I ain't that sort. Whatever brought you here, whatever's got those town gossips wagging their tongues, That's between you and the good Lord." Above, the woman's hand stilled briefly in her lap, though she remained silent. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the evening quiet. "My ranch ain't much," Caleb continued, steering the wagon around a bend where the trail narrowed between two rocky outcrops. "But it's peaceful, and you'll be safe there while you sort out your next steps. No one'll trouble you. You have my word on that." The wagon rolled on through the gathering dusk. Crickets began their evening chorus from the tall grass, and the first stars winked to life in the darkening eastern sky. They crossed the shallow creek where Caleb watered his stock, the horse's hooves splashing through the current just when he'd resigned himself to making the whole journey in silence. A voice emerged from beneath the sack, soft but clear, like distant church bells carrying across open country. "Evangeline Hart," she said. "My name is Evangeline Hart." Caleb nodded, though she couldn't see it. "Pleased to make your acquaintance. Miss Hart, I'm Caleb Boone. I heard them call you that at the station," she replied. Her voice grew quieter. "Why did you help me, Mr. Boone?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, considering. "Because it was right," he said finally. "And because my mama raised me better than to stand by while folks treat another soul like they ain't human." They crested a small rise, and there below them lay Caleb's ranch, nestled in a protected valley. The modest clapboard house stood sentinel over a barn, corral, and a few outbuildings. Golden lamplight spilled from the kitchen window where he'd left it burning that morning. "Almost there," he said, guiding the team down the gentle slope. "Another few minutes and we can get you properly settled." The horse's pace quickened slightly, knowing they were near home and evening feed. As they drew up before the house, Caleb set the brake and climbed down, moving around to help Evangeline from the wagon. Her hand trembled, but held firm as she gripped his offered support. "Watch your step here," he cautioned, guiding her safely to the ground. Path to the doors straight ahead, about 20 paces. He led her carefully up the wooden steps to the porch, then opened the door. The lamp's warm glow welcomed them into the kitchen, where a pot of beans still simmered on the back of the stove from that morning. Once inside, Caleb turned to face her. "Miss Hart," he said gently, "would you like me to help you remove that sack now?" She stood very still for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice wavered. "You should know. There's a reason they covered my face. A reason my intended refused me. Whatever it is," Caleb replied steadily, "you'll find no judgment here." Slowly, Evangeline raised her hands to the burlap. She hesitated just a moment more, then pulled it free. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. She was young, perhaps in her middle 20s, with eyes the color of summer sage. But what drew his gaze was the scar, an angry red mark that swept from her right temple down across her cheek to the corner of her mouth, twisting the skin into a permanent reminder of some past tragedy. Evangeline's shoulders tensed as she waited for his reaction, her fingers twisting the rough fabric of the sack. But Caleb only bowed his head, sorrow filling his heart for whatever pain had marked her so. "I'm right sorry for whatever caused you such suffering, Miss Hart," he said quietly. Surprise flickered across her features, followed by something that might have been relief. She'd clearly expected disgust or rejection, had probably seen plenty of both. Most folks can't bear to look at it, she said softly. Most folks are too quick to judge what they don't understand. Caleb replied. He moved to the stove, giving her space to collect herself. "Now then, there's beans warming here, and I've got fresh bread from yesterday. Would you care for some supper?" "Yes, thank you." The tension in her voice eased slightly, while Caleb busied himself with bowls and spoons. Evangeline's gaze traveled around the kitchen. It was plain but clean, with worn floorboards that had been recently swept and a row of brass hooks holding cooking utensils along one wall. "I've got a spare room just down the hall," Caleb said as he sliced the bread. "It ain't fancy, but the bed's comfortable, and there's a lock on the door. Keys yours to use as you please. Evangeline's eyes widened slightly at this consideration for her comfort and security. You're very kind, Mr. Boone. They ate their simple supper in companionable quiet, broken only by the occasional clink of spoons against bowls and the distant cry of a coyote greeting the rising moon. When they'd finished, Caleb showed her to the spare room, pointed out the washroom, and bid her good night. Later, as full darkness settled over the ranch, Evangeline stood at the window of her room. The glass reflected her scarred features back at her, but beyond it lay the peaceful valley, silvered by moonlight. A gentle breeze carried the scent of sage and pine through the partially opened window, so different from the sooty air of the eastern cities she'd left behind. She pressed her fingers to the cool glass, wondering if she dared believe in the sanctuary she'd found here. The day's events seemed almost dreamlike now. The humiliation at the station, the cruel laughter of the crowd. And then this quiet man with gentle eyes who'd stepped forward to offer protection without demanding explanations. The moon sailed higher, casting deep shadows across the yard. Somewhere in the barn, a horse nickered softly. Evangeline touched her scar, tracing its familiar path down her cheek, for the first time since the accident that had marked her. Since her intended had turned away in horror. Since she'd pinned her last hopes on a desperate journey west for the first time in so long. She felt something unfamiliar stirring in her heart. It might have been hope. She stood at the window for a long time, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, listening to the night sounds of this strange new place that offered the promise of safety. Whether that promise would prove true remained to be seen, but for now, in this quiet moment, it felt possible to believe dawn painted the Colorado sky in soft pinks and golds as Caleb led his bay gelding from the barn. The morning air held a crisp bite, promising another clear autumn day. He'd already been up for an hour, seeing to the morning chores. When movement near the house caught his eye, Evangeline stood uncertainly on the back porch, her hands twisting in her apron. She'd found one of his late wife's old work dresses in the spare room closet, and though it hung a bit loose, she'd managed to make it serviceable. "Good morning, Mr. Boone," she called softly. I was wondering if I might help with anything." Caleb paused in adjusting the saddle cinch. "That's right, kind of you to offer, Miss Hart. But you don't need to feel obliged. Please," she said, stepping down from the porch. "I'd like to make myself useful. If you'll show me what needs doing." He studied her for a moment, noting the determined set of her shoulders, despite her obvious nervousness. "Well, if you're sure." "The chickens need feeding. Feed barrels just inside the barn door." Evangeline nodded and made her way carefully to the barn. Caleb watched as she lifted the heavy lid of the feed barrel, struggling slightly with its weight. She scooped grain into a bucket, spilling some but pressing on. The chickens swarmed around her feet as she scattered feed, making her jump. But soon she was smiling slightly as they pecked and scratched, clearly pleased with herself for completing the task. "You did fine," Caleb said when she returned, brushing dust from her skirts. "Breakfast should be ready soon. Mary to Hearts brings food most mornings. She helps keep house since my wife ... Plows." He trailed off, then cleared his throat. "Well, she's been a blessing," as if summoned by her name. An older native woman appeared on the path leading to the ranch, carrying a covered basket. Her silver-streaked hair was braided neatly. She wore a mix of traditional dress and settler clothing. "Good morning, Caleb," she called. Then she caught sight of Evangeline and stopped short, surprise crossing her weathered features. "Mary, this here's Miss Evangeline Hart," Caleb said quickly. "She'll be staying with us a spell. Miss Hart, this is Mary Two Hearts, best cook in 3 counties." Mary's dark eyes took in Evangeline's scar without comment. She simply nodded and continued toward the house. "Come, food gets cold." They settled around Caleb's worn kitchen table as Mary laid out fresh biscuits, eggs, and coffee. The older woman moved with quiet efficiency, her presence somehow making the kitchen feel more homelike. "Thank you, Mary," Caleb said as she set a loaded plate before him. "This looks fine as always." Mary just smiled and squeezed his shoulder before gathering her basket. "I come back later. Clean things." With a final curious glance at Evangeline, she departed. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the clink of forks and the distant lowing of cattle. Finally, Evangeline set down her coffee cup, her hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Boone," she said softly, "I owe you an explanation." Caleb looked up, but didn't speak, giving her space to continue. "My father was Reverend Thomas Hart," she began. "He served a small parish back east, but his heart was always with the frontier missions. He spent years working with Native communities, especially here in Colorado. He... She touched her scarred cheek briefly. "He was there the night of the fire. The night I was marked." Caleb set down his fork, listening intently. "It was 3 years ago. Papa had been working to secure water rights for several Apache families, helping them file legal claims to springs on their ancestral lands. He'd gathered quite a packet of letters and documents proving their case." Her voice grew distant with memory. "The fire was set deliberately. They meant to destroy the papers and Papa. Papa died trying to save them. I survived, but... She gestured to her face. "I'm powerful. Sorry, Miss Hart," Caleb said quietly. "That's a heavy burden to carry." She nodded, blinking back tears. "The paper survived. Papa had hidden them well. But after he died, things got harder. No one would hire a scarred woman for respectable work. Finally, my aunt arranged a marriage out here, said a frontier man wouldn't be so particular about looks." Her bitter laugh held no humor. "But when my intended saw me, well, you can imagine, called me damaged goods and worse. Said no man would want me now." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice gentle. "Man like that ain't worth your tears, Miss Hart. Perhaps not. But he wasn't wrong about one thing. There are powerful men out here who want these papers destroyed. Men like Elias Crowder, who see native water rights as a threat to their expansion plans." She squared her shoulders. "Papa died protecting these documents. I won't let his sacrifice be in vain." "Crowder," Caleb said grimly. "I know of him. Man's been buying up every water source he can lay claim to, legal or not, forcing out small ranchers, native families alike. Yes, his men were at the station yesterday. I think they knew who I was, what I carried. That's why, double quotes, she touched the rough fabric of her borrowed dress. Remembering the humiliation of the burlap sack, the morning sun streamed through the window, catching the coffee pot and making it gleam like copper. Outside, a meadowlark trilled its morning song. "Miss Hart," Caleb said carefully, "those papers, are they safe?" She nodded. "I have them well hidden in my traveling bag. But... She hesitated. "I wonder if... That is, might I ask one more favor?" "Name it." "Do you have a safe place? Somewhere I could store them. I'd feel better knowing they were truly secure." Caleb rose and crossed to a corner of the kitchen. He knelt and pulled back the rug, revealing a trap door with a heavy iron ring. "Got a strongbox built right into the floor. My PA put it in years ago, used to store army pay when he worked as a scout. Combination lock, solid steel. About as secure as anything this side of Denver." Relief washed over Evangeline's face. "Oh, thank you. I'll fetch them right away." She hurried to her room and returned with a thick envelope, carefully wrapped in oilcloth. Caleb opened the strongbox, and she placed the packet inside with gentle reverence, as though handling something sacred. As the lock clicked shut, Evangeline let out a shaky breath. "There," At least now they're safe from fire. Caleb replaced the rug and stood, brushing dust from his knees. Miss Hart, I want you to know you're welcome to stay here as long as you need. Ain't much, but it's quiet. And folks hereabouts tend to mind their own business. She looked up at him, her sage-green eyes bright with unshed tears. Why are you being so kind to me? Because it's right, he said simply. And because I reckon your PA had the right of it, helping folks keep what's rightfully theirs, no matter who they are or where they come from. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, the first real smile he'd seen from her. Thank you, Mr. Boone, for everything. The morning sun continued its climb into the cloudless Colorado sky. In the barnyard, chickens scratched and pecked at the grain Evangeline had scattered. The day's work waited cattle to check, fences to mend. 1,000 tasks that kept a small ranch running, but for just that moment. In the quiet kitchen, still fragrant with Mary's biscuits, something shifted between them. Not romance, it was far too soon for that, with both their hearts still scarred by loss. But trust, perhaps. A first small seed of it. Taking root in fertile ground, the morning sun beat down on the dusty main street as Caleb guided his wagon past the rail station. He needed supplies, flour, coffee, ammunition, and a few other necessities. More importantly, he needed to show his face in town. To make it clear he wasn't hiding. The mercantile's bell jangled as he pushed through the door. Old Man Tucker looked up from his ledger, his wire-rimmed spectacles catching the light. "Morning, Mr. Boone," Tucker said, his tone careful. "What can I get for you today?" Caleb handed over his list. "Just the usual, Mr. Tucker. And maybe some yard goods. If you've got anything suitable for a lady's dress." Tucker's eyebrows rose, but he said nothing, just shuffled toward the back to gather the items. As Caleb waited, the bell rang again. 2 women entered, their Sunday best dresses rustling. They stopped short when they saw him. "Why, if it isn't Mr. Boone," one whispered to the other, loud enough to carry. "The one who bought the scarred bride." "Shameful business," her companion replied. "Taking in damaged goods like that. Makes you wonder what's wrong with him." Caleb's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his face neutral. The women weren't worth the breath it would take to correct them. Still, their words burned like acid in his gut. Tucker returned with an armload of supplies. "Got some nice calico just came in," he said, gesturing to a shelf of fabric. "Good sturdy cotton, suitable for everyday wear." "I'll take 10 yards of the blue," Caleb said, "and the same of that cream-colored muslin." As Tucker measured and cut the fabric, the bell rang once more. This time, Elias Crowder stepped through the door, his expensive boots clicking on the wooden floor. The women immediately fell silent, bobbing quick curtsies before hurrying out. Crowder was tall and well-dressed, his silver watch chain glinting across his vest. But there was something cold in his pale eyes that made him look more predator than gentleman. "Well now," Crowder drawled, "if it isn't the Good Samaritan himself." He moved closer, his smile sharp as a knife. "I heard about your charitable act yesterday, taking in that unfortunate creature." Caleb continued, checking his supplies, not looking up. "Miss Hart is a respectable woman under my protection, Mr. Crowder. That's all anyone needs to know. Protection." Crowder chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "From what, I wonder? Or should I ask, from whom?" He leaned against the counter, too close for comfort. "You're a decent rancher, Boone. Small spread, but you work hard. Be a shame if something were to interfere with that." Now Caleb did look up, meeting Crowder's gaze steadily. "That sounds mighty close to a threat, sir." "Just friendly advice." Crowder's voice dropped lower. "Damaged goods bring nothing but trouble. Best to send her on her way before that trouble finds you. She's under my roof." Caleb said quietly, each word clear as a bell in the sudden silence of the store. "She's under my protection." That's all there is to say on the matter. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Tucker busied himself with reorganizing already neat shelves, clearly wanting no part of the tension crackling between them. Finally, Crowder straightened, adjusting his fine coat. "Have it your way, Boone, but remember, I warned you fair and square." He touched the brim of his hat and strode out, leaving the air feeling somehow cleaner for his absence. Caleb paid for his purchases and loaded them into the wagon. The whole way home, he turned Crowder's words over in his mind. The cattle baron hadn't gotten where he was by making idle threats. There would be trouble coming, sure as sunrise. Back at the ranch, he found Evangeline pacing the porch, her hands twisting in her apron. When she saw him, relief washed over her face. "I was getting worried," she said, hurrying to help him with the supplies. "You were gone so long, ... Had some business to tend to," he said, not wanting to worry her with the details of Crowder's threat. "Got you some fabric, though. Thought you might want to make yourself a new dress or two." Her eyes widened at the sight of the carefully wrapped parcels. "Oh, but you shouldn't have. That is, it's too much ... ain't too much at all." He carried the flour into the kitchen. A woman needs proper clothes. She followed him, touching the soft fabric with wondering fingers. "Thank you. I'll pay you back, somehow. No need." He started putting away the supplies. "Your help around here is payment enough. Speaking of which, something sure smells good." A shy smile crossed her face. "Mary showed me how to make her rabbit stew before she left. I thought, well, I hoped it might be a proper thank you." "For everything?" The kitchen was warm and fragrant, with the smell of herbs and cooking meat. 2 places were already set at the table, and a loaf of fresh bread cooled on the windowsill. It looked right, somehow. Homely as evening settled over the ranch, they sat down to their simple meal. The lamplight cast a gentle glow, softening the edges of Evangeline's scar. She served the stew with careful hands, and Caleb had to admit it was as good as Mary's own. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, broken only by the distant cry of a coyote and the peaceful sounds of night settling over the ranch. Finally, Evangeline spoke. "I want you to know," she said softly, "that I understand what it means, you taking me in. The risk to your reputation, your standing in town." She looked down at her bowl. If you think it best that I move on, ... No." The word came out sharper than he intended, and he gentled his tone. "No, Miss Hart. You're welcome here as long as you need. Don't you fret about reputation or standing. Those ain't worth much if they keep a person from doing what's right." She looked up then, meeting his eyes across the table. Something passed between them, not romance, exactly, but understanding. Trust, growing stronger with each passing hour. "Thank you," she whispered. Outside, the stars began to appear, one by one, in the vast Colorado sky. Inside, the lamp burned steady and bright, holding the darkness at bay. For now at least, they were safe. Tomorrow would bring what it brought, but for this moment, peace reigned in the little ranch house. The rabbit stew grew cold in their bowls as they sat together. 2 souls finding comfort in simple companionship, while beyond the lamplight's reach, unseen forces gathered like storm clouds on the horizon. The morning sun cast long shadows across the barnyard as Evangeline scattered feed for the chickens. Her movements were more confident now, no longer tentative as they had been in her first days at the ranch. The hens clucked and pecked around her feet, familiar with her presence after nearly a week of care. "There you go, ladies," she murmured, watching them scratch at the ground. The routine brought her comfort, these simple tasks that made her feel useful. Needed, from the corner of her eye, she caught Caleb watching from the corral where he mended a section of fence. His expression was thoughtful, and when their eyes met, he offered a small nod of approval. Heat rose to her cheeks, but she didn't turn away. These quiet moments of acknowledgement had become precious to her. Later that morning, Evangeline sat in the patch of sunlight by the kitchen window, carefully examining one of Caleb's work shirts. The fabric was worn thin in places, with several tears along the seams. Her needle flashed in the light as she worked, creating neat, even stitches. "Ain't never seen anyone take such care with my old clothes before," Caleb said from the doorway. Startling her, Evangeline smoothed the shirt across her lap. "These shirts still have plenty of wear left in them. Just need a bit of attention, is all." She held up her work for his inspection. "See? Good as new." He stepped closer, running calloused fingers over her mending. "Better than new, I'd say. You've got a gift for making broken things whole again." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither dared explore. Evangeline busied herself with knotting off her thread, hoping he wouldn't notice how her hands trembled. The days fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Evangeline rose early to help with morning chores, learning the ways of ranch life one task at a time. She discovered she had a way with the chickens, coaxing even the most reluctant hen to give up her eggs. The vegetable garden, though small, flourished under her attention. In the afternoons, she worked inside, turning the ranch house from a bachelor shelter into something that felt more like a home. She scrubbed floors, hung curtains made from flour sacks, and filled mason jars with wild plums she gathered from the creek bank. Caleb noticed every change, every small improvement. He found himself pausing in his work just to watch her hang laundry on the line. Her movements graceful despite the wind that tugged at her skirts. Sometimes she would hum as she worked old hymns mostly, their familiar melodies carrying across the yard. "You're smiling more these days," his nearest neighbor, Old Joe, commented one afternoon as they worked together to repair a fallen section of fence. "That girl's been good for you." Caleb drove another post into the ground with more force than necessary. "She's just staying until she finds her feet. That's all." MMHMM. Old Joe's weathered face creased with knowing. "And I reckon the sun just rises in the east 'cause it's convenient like." That evening, Evangeline prepared a hearty stew, letting it simmer while she baked a fresh loaf of bread. The kitchen filled with warmth and savory scents that made the ranch house feel more like home than it had in years. They ate by the hearth, the flickering firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls. Caleb watched as Evangeline broke off a piece of bread, noticing how she'd grown more comfortable in his presence. The fearful tension that had marked her first days had eased into something quieter, more peaceful. "I used to dream about having a big family," she said suddenly, her voice soft but clear in the evening quiet. "When I was young, before, double quotes her fingers brushed the scar on her face. I wanted a house full of children, noise, and laughter." "Silly dreams, I suppose." Caleb set down his spoon, his heart aching at the resignation in her voice. He thought of his own lost family, his wife Sarah, their infant son who had lived barely long enough to draw breath. The fever had taken them both, leaving him alone with his grief. "Dreams ain't silly," he said carefully. "And God, well, He has His own way of surprising us sometimes." Evangeline looked up, meeting his gaze across the firelight. Something vulnerable flickered in her eyes, like a candle flame caught in a draft. "Do you really believe that?" She whispered, "That happiness might still be possible, even for someone like me." "I believe," Caleb said slowly, choosing his words with care, "that the good Lord doesn't make mistakes. And that sometimes what looks like an ending turns out to be just the beginning of something new." A lone coyote's howl pierced the night, making them both start. The sound was closer than usual, wild and haunting. Evangeline shivered, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Sounds lonely out there," she murmured. "They hunt in packs." "Usually," Caleb said, rising to add another log to the fire. "When you hear one calling like that, means something's got them stirred up. Change coming? Maybe." The words hung in the air like smoke, carrying a weight neither of them wanted to examine too closely. They finished their meal in thoughtful silence, each lost in private reflection. Later that night, after Caleb had retired to his room, Evangeline knelt beside her bed. The rough floorboards pressed against her knees, grounding her in the moment as she bowed her head. "Lord," she whispered. Her hands clasped tight. "I know I'm not worthy of asking for more than you've already given me. This safe haven, Caleb's kindness, it's more than I deserved." She paused, gathering her courage. "But if it be your will, please give me strength for whatever lies ahead. Help me be brave enough to face whatever storms may come." Through the window, she could see stars scattered across the vast Colorado sky like diamonds on black velvet. The coyote called again, farther away now, its voice echoing across the empty spaces between earth and heaven. Evangeline rose from her knees. Her prayer finished, but her heart still full of unspoken hopes and fears. She touched the scar on her face, a gesture that had once been bitter, but now felt more like remembrance. This place, this quiet ranch with its simple routines and honest work, had begun to heal something deep inside her that she'd thought forever broken. She moved to the window, watching as clouds drifted across the moon. The ranch lay peaceful in the silvery light. The barn, the corral, the garden she'd brought back to life. In just a few short weeks, she'd found purpose here, pride in work well done, and something that felt dangerously close to belonging. The night wind stirred the curtains she'd hung, carrying with it the scent of sage and prairie grass. Evangeline stood for a long moment, drinking in the quiet, storing up this peace against whatever tomorrow might bring. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Caleb made his way to the barn. Something felt wrong. Jake, his most reliable ranch hand, hadn't shown up for the afternoon feeding. The horses nickered softly as Caleb entered, the familiar scent of hay and leather doing little to ease his growing unease. He found the note nailed to the post near Jake's usual workstation. The paper trembled in his hands as he read the hastily scrawled message. "Mr. Boone, can't work here no more. Got warned in town. They said trouble's coming, and I got family to think about. Sorry." Caleb crumpled the paper in his fist. Jake had worked these pastures for 3 years. A good man, steady with the cattle, always quick with a joke. Now gone, scared off by Crowder's threats. Through the barn door, he could see Evangeline hanging sheets on the line, her movements careful and measured. She'd finally started to find her place here, learning the rhythms of ranch life. But now, watching her, he noticed how she kept glancing toward the road, as though expecting danger to appear at any moment. At supper, the kitchen was unusually quiet. Evangeline served the meal, beef stew and fresh biscuits, but hardly touched her own portion. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her spoon. "Jake quit," Caleb said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "Got threatened in town." Evangeline's face fell, the scar on her cheek seeming darker in the lamplight. "Because of me," she whispered, just like before. "Everywhere I go, trouble follows." "No," Caleb said firmly. "This ain't your doing. It's Crowder and his kind, thinking they can bully folks into giving up what's right. Perhaps, ... double quotes, she swallowed hard. Perhaps it would be better if I moved on. Found somewhere else too? No." Caleb's voice was quiet but firm. "Running won't solve nothing. Besides, where would you go?" Evangeline straightened in her chair, something fierce flickering in her eyes. "You're right. I won't run. Not this time. My father taught me that standing up for what's right matters more than being safe." She touched the scar on her face. "I've already survived worse than Crowder's threats." Caleb nodded, respect warming his gaze. But before he could respond, a sharp knock rattled the front door. They both froze, exchanging alarmed glances. The knock came again, more urgent this time, Caleb rose slowly, checking that his rifle was within reach. "Stay here," he murmured to Evangeline, moving cautiously toward the door. When he opened it, the lamplight spilled out onto the porch, illuminating a thin, trembling figure. A boy, no more than 12 years old, stood there with wide, frightened eyes. His clothes were trailed dusty, his face scratched from pushing through brush. Native features marked him as Apache, though fear had robbed his face of its natural dignity. "Please," the boy gasped. "They're coming. I need help." Evangeline appeared behind Caleb, her hand flying to her mouth. "Child, you're half frozen. Come in quickly." The boy stumbled inside, clutching something to his chest. As Caleb secured the door, Evangeline guided the young visitor to the fire. "I'm Evangeline Hart," she said gently. "What's your name?" "Tomas," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands shook as he held out a weathered envelope. "My father said, if anything happened, find Minister Hart's daughter. Show her the letter." Evangeline took the envelope, her face paling as she recognized her father's careful handwriting. Inside was one of the water rights letters she'd brought west, documents promising to protect Apache access to the Valley Springs. My father entrusted copies to the tribal leaders. She explained to Caleb, who had moved closer. "This one bears my father's signature and Chief Running Wolf's mark." She looked at Tomas. "Was Running Wolf your father?" Tomas shook his head. "My uncle. He... The boy's voice broke. "Crowder's men came. Said we had no right to the water. Uncle showed them the letter. But they... double quotes, he couldn't continue." Caleb knelt beside the boy's chair, his voice gentle. "What happened, son?" "They shot him." Tomas's words were barely audible. "Said letters don't mean nothing to dead men. I ran. Been hiding in the hills, but they're still looking. Please." Minister Hart's daughter was supposed to help. Evangeline's hands trembled as she clutched the letter. "Of course, we'll help. My father's promises must be honored." She met Caleb's eyes. "We can't turn him away." Caleb studied the boy's face, seeing past the fear to something that struck deep in his heart, the same vulnerability he'd seen in his own son's face during those terrible fever-racked nights. The memory of holding his child as the life slipped away crashed over him anew. But this time, instead of closing his heart, the pain cracked it open. "No one's turning you away." "Boy," he said gruffly, resting a careful hand on Tomas's shoulder. "You're safe here." Evangeline was already moving, gathering blankets and heating milk on the stove. Her movements were swift and sure, as though caring for this frightened child had awakened something in her that had long lain dormant. "When did you last eat?" she asked, adding honey to the warm milk. "Yesterday, maybe," Tomas admitted. "Been mostly hiding while Evangeline prepared a plate of leftovers." Caleb checked the windows, drawing the curtains tight. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the lonely cry of a coyote. The sound seemed to make Tomas shrink further into his chair. "Ain't nothing getting past these walls tonight," Caleb assured him, noting how the boy's shoulders relaxed slightly at the words. They watched as Tomas ate, his movements growing less frantic as warmth and food began to work their magic. Evangeline kept close, her natural gentleness drawing out bits of his story between bites. The picture that emerged was grim Crowder's men systematically destroying evidence of water rights, using fear and violence to drive families from their ancestral lands. "My father always said that justice would prevail," Evangeline murmured, smoothing Tomas's blanket. "But he never said it would come easy." Caleb stood at the window, scanning the darkness. The boy's presence changed everything. It was one thing to shelter Evangeline, to stand against town gossip and veiled threats. But harboring Tomas meant open defiance of Crowder's plans. It meant choosing a side in a fight that could cost them everything, yet watching Evangeline tend to the exhausted child. Seeing how naturally she slipped into the role of protector, Caleb felt something shift inside him. The lonely ache that had haunted him since losing his family eased slightly, replaced by a fierce determination to defend what was forming here. This fragile beginning of something that felt like hope will need to make plans, he said quietly to Evangeline once Tomas had fallen asleep in the chair. Crowder won't take this lying down. She nodded, her face set with quiet resolve. No, he won't. But we have truth on our side. And my father's letters. The law will have to listen eventually. Law's a long way off out here, Caleb reminded her. Meanwhile, we've got a scared boy to protect and a ranch to defend. Then we'll do both, Evangeline said simply, her hand finding his in the lamplight. Together, the touch was brief, but it sealed something between them, a commitment deeper than words could express. Outside, the wind continued to moan across the prairie. But inside the ranch house, three lost souls had found something they thought forever lost. The chance to be a family. Dawn broke over the Colorado range in streaks of pale gold. Caleb saddled his horse while the morning dew still clung to the grass, preparing for a long day of riding fence lines. The work couldn't wait, even with their unexpected guest. You'll be all right, he asked Evangeline, who stood on the porch with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She nodded, her scarred face serene in the early light. We'll manage. Tomas and I can handle things here. As if summoned by his name, the Apache boy appeared in the doorway, already dressed and alert. His dark eyes tracked Caleb's movements with careful attention. Gates need checking too, Caleb said, swinging into the saddle. South pasture especially. I know about gates, Tomas offered quietly, and fences. I can help here. Caleb studied the boy, noting the earnest set of his thin shoulders. Much obliged, then. Miss Hart will show you what needs doing. Evangeline's hand rested briefly on Tomas's shoulder. We'll keep busy. Be careful out there, Caleb. He touched the brim of his hat and turned his horse toward the rising sun. Behind him, the ranch house seemed different, somehow warmer, more alive with its two new inhabitants. The morning passed in steady work for those left at the ranch. Evangeline showed Tomas the daily routines, feeding chickens, checking water troughs, gathering eggs. The boy moved with natural grace, his initial shyness giving way to quiet competence. Near midday, Evangeline found him in the tool shed, hands moving surely over a broken hay fork. That's been giving Caleb trouble for weeks, she said, watching as Tomas worked. The joint was weak, he explained, demonstrating how he'd reinforced it. My people learn to fix things, make them last. Your people are wise, Evangeline said softly. She saw how he straightened at her words, pride briefly displacing his wariness. They worked through the afternoon, Tomas proving increasingly useful. He showed Evangeline how to better secure the chicken coop against predators, while she taught him her father's method of organizing tools. Their hands grew dirty, but their hearts grew lighter with shared purpose. The sun was setting when Caleb returned, dust-covered and weary. He found them in the kitchen, where Evangeline was teaching Tomas to knead bread dough. Smells good in here, he said. Hanging his hat by the door, Tomas has been a tremendous help, Evangeline replied, her eyes bright. You should see how he fixed that troublesome hay fork. The boy ducked his head, but Caleb caught the ghost of a smile. That's so? Reckon we're lucky to have such skilled hands around here. They gathered for supper as darkness settled outside. Evangeline had made a hearty stew, and fresh bread steamed on the table. For a while, there was only the comfortable sounds of eating, but gradually, Tomas began to speak. The spring, he said, stirring his stew. It belonged to everyone before. My father said water is like air meant to be shared. Caleb set down his spoon, listening intently. The letters promised we could stay. Tomas continued. Said the water rights were ours too. But Crowder's men, ... He swallowed hard. They put up fences. Shot our dogs when they came to drink. Said we had no proof, no rights. Your uncle tried to show them the letter, Evangeline said gently. Tomas nodded, his face shadowed. They tore it up. But Uncle had hidden another copy. Told me to run. Find Minister Hart's daughter. His eyes met Evangeline's. Said she would remember her father's promise. Your uncle was right, Evangeline assured him. Those promises still stand. You're safe here, boy, Caleb added firmly. No one's going to harm you under this roof. Tomas studied them both, hope warring with doubt in his young face. But Crowder's men, they'll come looking. Let them come, Caleb said quietly. We've got right on our side. And sometimes that's enough. After supper, they gathered in the sitting room. Caleb built up the fire while Evangeline mended a shirt, Tomas watching the flames with thoughtful eyes. The crackling wood and clicking needles filled the peaceful silence. Are you married? Tomas asked suddenly, his voice small but clear. The question hung in the air. Caleb's hands stilled on the poker, and Evangeline's needle paused mid-stitch. Their eyes met across the room, holding a wealth of unspoken things. No, Evangeline said finally, her scarred cheek flushing slightly. We're not, but you act like family, Tomas persisted, looking between them with a child's direct wisdom. Caleb cleared his throat. Sometimes family isn't just about marriage, boy. Sometimes it's about finding folks who stand by you when times are hard. Evangeline's eyes softened as she looked at him, something warm and wondering in her gaze. The firelight played across her face, and for a moment, Caleb saw past the scar to the gentle strength beneath. Would you lead us in prayer? He asked her quietly, like your father used to. She nodded, setting aside her mending. They bowed their heads as her clear voice filled the room. Dear Lord, she began, we thank you for this day, for safety and shelter, for bringing us together under this roof. Watch over us through the night. And help us remember that your family is bigger than blood. It's built on love, trust, and doing what's right. Amen. Amen, Caleb echoed softly. Amen, whispered Tomas. His small face peaceful in the firelight. They remained there, heads bowed, connected by something deeper than words, three lonely souls finding anchor in each other's presence. Their prayers rising like smoke into the gathering night. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear over the Colorado range. Caleb rose early, his movements deliberate as he donned his best shirt and polished his worn boots. Through the window, he watched Evangeline helping Tomas straighten his borrowed collar, her gentle hands smoothing the fabric with motherly care. The wagon creaked as Caleb hitched up the horses, their breath steaming in the cool morning air. He'd made this weekly journey to town alone for years, but today felt different. Today, truth would have its say ready. He called softly from the yard. Evangeline emerged from the house, wearing her Sunday dress and clutching a leather folder close to her chest. Inside lay her father's letters, precious proof of promises made. Tomas followed, looking uncomfortable but determined in his borrowed clothes. As ready as I'll ever be, Evangeline answered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Caleb helped them up onto the wagon seat, noting how Evangeline's fingers tightened around the leather folder. The morning sun caught the rough texture of her scar, but there was beauty in her determined expression that made his heart swell. The wagon wheels turned steadily along the dusty road to town. Few words passed between them, each lost in their own thoughts. Tomas sat straight-backed between them, his dark eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting trouble. The little white church came into view, its weathered steeple reaching toward the cloudless sky. Wagons and horses already crowded the yard, and the sound of him singing drifted through the open windows. "Quite a crowd today," Caleb observed quietly, helping Evangeline down from the wagon. "Good," she replied, though her voice quavered. More to hear the truth. They climbed the wooden steps together, Tomas close behind. The singing grew louder as they approached the door. Heads turned as they entered, and the final notes of Amazing Grace faded into whispers. The congregation filled every pew. Ranchers, shopkeepers, and their families sat shoulder to shoulder in their Sunday best. Near the front, Caleb spotted Elias Crowder, his expression dark as storm clouds. Preacher Matthews stood at his pulpit, his lined face thoughtful as he watched them enter. "Welcome, friends," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. "Please, find seats." But Evangeline stepped forward instead, her father's folder clutched tight. "Begging your pardon, Preacher Matthews, but I have something that needs saying." The whispers grew louder. Someone muttered about that scarred woman. Caleb's jaw tightened. But he held his peace, watching Evangeline gather her courage. "Speak then, child," Preacher Matthews said kindly. "God's house is a place for truth." Evangeline moved to the front of the church, her steps slow but purposeful. Tomas remained close to Caleb, both of them watching her with quiet pride. Her hands shook as she opened the folder, but her voice rang clear. "These letters were written by my father, Minister Thomas Hart. He was a man who believed in God's justice and man's duty to honor their word." She unfolded the first letter, the paper crackling in the hushed church. 3 years ago, my father witnessed agreements between the settlers and the Apache people. Promises were made about water rights and grazing land. Promises sealed before God and put down in writing. Crowder shifted in his seat, his face darkening further. But Evangeline continued, reading from the letters. Her father's words filled the church, speaking of shared springs of peace between neighbors, of God's command to deal justly with all his children. "These promises were broken," she said, looking up from the pages. "Men were killed, children left fatherless, all because some chose greed over God's law." The silence in the church grew heavier. Evangeline touched her scarred cheek briefly, as if drawing strength from her own wounds. "I know what it is to be judged by appearance, to be cast aside as worthless. But God sees deeper, and so must we." Her eyes found Tomas, standing brave beside Caleb. This boy's uncle died protecting these rights. His people suffer while we worship in comfort. What does our faith mean if we turn away from such injustice? Preacher Matthews stepped down from his pulpit, taking the letters she offered. He read them carefully, his weathered face grave. The congregation waited, barely breathing. Finally, he looked up. "These documents bear proper witness. The agreements they record are binding in both law and conscience." He turned to face his congregation. "We cannot claim to serve God while breaking sacred promises." A murmur ran through the church. Crowder stood abruptly, his face mottled with rage. "That scarred woman's got no right. She has every right." Caleb's voice cut through the tension. He moved forward, his steps measured, until he stood beside Evangeline. Without hesitation, he took her scarred hand in his, holding it for all to see. "And so do the people these letters protect." The gesture seemed to break something in the church's atmosphere. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Old Mr. Jenkins nodded slowly, his face thoughtful. Even the preacher's stern wife managed a small smile. "The letters will be recorded properly," Preacher Matthews declared. "And we as a community will see these promises honored." His eyes met Crowder's challenging stare. All of us, Evangeline's hand tightened in Caleb's grip. He felt her trembling subside, replaced by a new steadiness. Tomas moved to stand with them, and together they faced the congregation not as outcasts, but as people of principle. The morning sun streamed through the church windows, catching the dust motes in beams of light. Preacher Matthews called for a hymn, and as the congregation rose to sing, Evangeline's clear voice joined the others. For the first time since her father's death, since the fire that marked her face, since all the lonely days that followed, she felt the warmth of belonging wash over her. The hymn swelled, filling the small church with hope. Caleb's strong hand held hers. Tomas stood tall beside them, and the truth had been spoken at last. In that moment, Evangeline understood that healing came in many forms, not just in the mending of flesh, but in the restoration of justice, in the keeping of promises, in the courage to stand together when the final notes faded. Preacher Matthews raised his hands in blessing. The morning light touched Evangeline's face, scar and all, and she lifted her chin proudly. She was exactly where she needed to be. After the service ended, sunlight streamed through the church's tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Preacher Matthews gestured toward his study, a small room off the sanctuary where the smell of fresh coffee already wafted through the door. "Please join me," he said warmly, ushering Caleb and Evangeline inside. Mrs. Matthews always keeps a pot brewing after service. The study was cramped but cozy, with well-worn leather chairs and bookshelves lining the walls. Tomas lingered in the doorway until Evangeline beckoned him in with a gentle smile. "That took courage," the preacher said, pouring coffee into tin cups. Both the speaking and the hearing of hard truths. Evangeline wrapped her hands around the warm cup, her father's letters now safely tucked away. "I feared no one would listen. Truth has a way of making itself heard," Preacher Matthews replied, settling into his chair. His eyes moved between Caleb and Evangeline, noting how they had unconsciously drawn their chairs closer together. The Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing people together when they need each other most. Caleb's weathered hands tightened around his cup. "Reckon he does at that." The preacher's smile deepened, crow's feet crinkling at his eyes. "You know, I've been performing marriages in this valley for 20 years now. When two hearts are already joined in purpose and faith, the blessing is just putting words to what the Lord has already done." Color rose in Evangeline's cheeks, and she ducked her head. Caleb cleared his throat, but his eyes sought hers across the rim of his coffee cup. "Just something to consider," Preacher Matthews added softly. "Whenever you're ready." Through the study window, they could hear the congregation dispersing, boot heels and wagon wheels on packed earth. Some voices carried approval of the morning's events, while others held notes of discord. "Ain't right. Letting that scarred woman stand up there," someone muttered. "Hush now," came another voice. "Did you hear how she read them letters?" Pure courage, that was. Tomas, who had been quietly watching from his perch on a stack of books, suddenly grinned and darted toward the door. "Can I go look at the horses?" he asked, bouncing on his toes. Evangeline nodded, but Caleb's eyes narrowed as he followed the boy's path through the window. Across the street, 3 of Crowder's men lounged against the hitching post, their expressions dark as storm clouds. "We should head back," Caleb said, rising quickly. "Thank you for the coffee, preacher, and everything else." Outside, the autumn air held a crisp bite. Caleb hurried Evangeline and Tomas toward their wagon, keeping himself between them and Crowder's watching men. The boy scrambled up onto the seat while Caleb helped Evangeline climb aboard, his hand lingering protectively at her waist. The ride home was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts as the wagon wheels creaked along the familiar trail. The afternoon sun painted the valley in gold, touching the distant mountains with fire. When they crested the final rise, the ranch spread out below them, modest but well-tended. A place of safety as evening settled over the land, peace seemed to settle with it. Evangeline moved about the kitchen, humming hymns from the morning service while she prepared their supper. The familiar tune of Amazing Grace drifted through the house, mingling with the homey sounds of cooking and the quiet murmur of Tomas. helping Caleb with evening chores. Caleb paused in the doorway, watching her work. She had rolled up her sleeves, flour dusting her arms as she kneaded bread dough. The lamplight caught her profile, and for a moment he forgot about her scar entirely. He saw only the gentle curve of her smile, the way her hands moved with sure purpose. The peace that seemed to radiate from her very being. Something long broken inside him shifted, like a door finally swinging back into place. The house hadn't felt this much like a home since he'd lost his first family to fever years ago. The empty rooms had been filled with shadows then, but now they held warmth and light, the promise of new beginnings. Evangeline looked up, catching his gaze. "Supper's nearly ready," she said softly. "Smells like heaven itself," he replied. His voice rough with emotion. Tomas burst in through the back door, breaking the moment. "Miss Evangeline." The bread smell got all the way to the barn. She laughed, a sound as clear as chapel bells. "Well then, you'd best wash up quick if you want some while it's hot." They gathered around the table, heads bowed for grace. The lamplight cast a golden glow over their faces as Evangeline's quiet prayer filled the room. Caleb found himself watching her lips form the familiar words, thinking of what the preacher had said about hearts already joined. But as they ate, sharing the fresh bread and stew, Caleb couldn't shake the memory of those riders watching from across the street. His eyes kept straying to the window, where darkness gathered thick against the glass. Through the evening's quiet, he heard the distant sound of hooves on the ridge, moving slow and deliberate. Evangeline was still humming softly as she cleared the dishes, and Tomas had fallen asleep in his chair. But Caleb's shoulders, tense said, out there in the gathering night. Riders waited and watched. Their shadows moved against the stars, patient as wolves circling a flock. The peace inside the ranch house felt suddenly fragile, like a soap bubble that could burst at the slightest touch. Caleb rose quietly, not wanting to alarm Evangeline. He moved to the window, scanning the darkness. The riders were too far to make out clearly, but he knew they were Crowder's men. The truth spoken in church that morning wouldn't go unanswered. The hymn Evangeline had been humming faded into silence. She stood at his shoulder, her presence warm and steady. "You see them too?" "Yes," he answered simply, resisting the urge to pull her away from the window. She touched his arm gently. "We knew there would be a price for speaking truth. Worth every penny," he said firmly, covering her hand with his own. Behind them, Tomas stirred in his chair, blinking sleepily. The boy's presence reminded Caleb of all they had to protect now, not just land and water rights, but this fragile new family taking root under his roof. The evening settled deeper around the ranch house. Inside, lamps glowed warm against the shadows, and the scent of fresh bread lingered in the air. The room held all the pieces of the home Caleb had thought forever, lost: a woman's gentle humming, a child's peaceful sleep, the promise of tomorrow's bread rising in a covered bowl. But outside, dark shapes moved against the stars, and the night held no answers about what morning might bring. The ranch house creaked in the midnight stillness. Evangeline stirred from her sleep, troubled by an unfamiliar scent. Smoke, not the comforting aroma of the hearth, but something sharper, more urgent. Her heart began to pound. Orange light flickered through her window, too bright for this hour. She rushed to the glass, and horror seized her throat. The barn was ablaze, flames already climbing the weathered boards like hungry demons. "Caleb!" she screamed, running barefoot down the hall. Fire! Doors crashed open. Caleb emerged from his room, pulling on his boots. Tomas appeared wide-eyed behind him. "Get water," Caleb ordered, already racing for the door. "And stay clear of the barn." Heat slapped their faces as they burst into the yard. The fire roared, consuming the barn's eastern wall. Inside, horses screamed in terror, their hooves thundering against their stalls. Caleb sprinted toward the inferno. The horses, he shouted. Dear God, the horses. Evangeline grabbed Tomas's hand, pulling him toward the well. Quick now. The bucket? They worked frantically, passing water to Caleb as he fought to reach the barn door. The metal latch burned his palm, but he wrenched it open. Smoke billowed out, thick and choking. Stay back, he ordered, plunging into the darkness. Inside, hell itself seemed to have taken hold. Flames crawled across the hayloft, dropping burning strands onto the stalls below. The horses thrashed in panic, eyes rolling white in the savage light. Caleb's lungs burned as he stumbled to the first stall. His mare, Belle, reared against her rope. With shaking hands, he freed her, slapping her flank. She bolted for the door, nearly trampling him in her terror. The other horses. Evangeline cried from outside. Hurry. One by one, Caleb released them. Each animal crashed past him into the night, trailing sparks like falling stars. The heat grew unbearable. Timbers groaned overhead. Evangeline stood at the barn's entrance, Tomas clutching her skirts. Caleb, get out. The roof? He turned to flee, but a terrible cracking sound froze him in place. The hayloft was giving way. Burning hay and timber plummeted toward him like a flaming avalanche. Caleb. Evangeline screamed. He dove forward, rolling beneath the cascade of fire. Pain seared across his back, but he gained his feet and staggered out into the cool night air. Evangeline rushed to him, helping him away from the building. Behind them, the barn skeleton shuddered. With a sound like thunder, the roof collapsed, sending a geyser of sparks toward the stars. Are you hurt? Evangeline's hands fluttered over him, checking for burns. I'm fine, he gasped, still coughing. The horses, they're safe, she assured him. All of them made it. Tomas pointed into the darkness. Look, riders. Through the smoke, shadowy figures on horseback materialized at the edge of the firelight. Their faces were hidden by bandanas, but their intentions were clear in the rifles they carried. Inside, Caleb shouted, pushing Evangeline and Tomas toward the house. Run. They sprinted across the yard, but more riders emerged from the darkness, cutting off their escape. Hooves thundered around them, creating a circle of menace. Crowder sends his regards, one rider sneered. Everything happened at once. Two men dismounted, lunging for Tomas. Evangeline screamed and tried to hold him, but rough hands tore them apart. Caleb charged forward, but a rifle butt caught him in the stomach, doubling him over. No. Tomas thrashed in his captor's grip. Let me go, please. Evangeline sobbed. He's just a boy. The riders ignored her pleas. They threw Tomas across a saddle like a sack of grain, binding his hands with rope. The boy's terrified eyes found Evangeline's face one last time before a cloth was pulled over his head. Consider this a warning, the lead rider said. Next time, it won't just be the barn. Hooves pounded earth as the riders wheeled their horses around. They vanished into the darkness, taking Tomas with them. His muffled cries grew fainter until only the crackling of flames remained. Caleb staggered to his feet, clutching his ribs. No, he whispered. No. The barn's remains cast a hellish glow across the yard. Smoke stung their eyes, but the tears that fell had nothing to do with the fire. Caleb dropped to his knees in the ash, his shoulders shaking. Evangeline collapsed beside him, her face streaked with soot and grief. This is my fault, she choked out. I've brought nothing but ruin to your home. My curse follows everywhere I go. Don't, Caleb said roughly. Don't say that, but it's true. She pressed her scarred face into her hands. First my father, then the rejection, and now this. Everyone who helps me suffers. Caleb grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. Listen to me. You are not cursed. This is Crowder's evil, not yours." She shook her head, unconvinced. "Tomas trusted us to protect him." "We failed. We'll find him," Caleb vowed, though his voice cracked. Whatever it takes. The night wind carried ash and embers around them like dying fireflies. The horses they'd saved huddled at the far end of the pasture, still trembling. Everything they'd built, all the peace they'd found, lay in smoking ruins. Slowly, as though moved by the same spirit, they both sank to their knees in the ash. Evangeline's hands found Caleb's, squeezing tight. "Dear Lord," she whispered, her voice raw with tears, "please protect Tomas. Give us strength to endure this trial. Show us the way forward when all seems lost. Amen," Caleb murmured. They knelt there together as the barn's remains smoldered, sending threads of smoke toward heaven like desperate prayers. The night pressed close around them, full of shadows and loss, but they held fast to each other, refusing to let go. Dawn would come. But for now, they could only kneel in the ashes of their hopes, clinging to faith when all else had burned away. The morning sun cast long shadows across the smoking ruins of the barn. Caleb and Evangeline moved carefully through the ashes, their boots crunching on charred timber. The acrid smell of burnt hay and wood hung heavy in the air. "So much destroyed," Evangeline whispered. Pushing aside a blackened board, something glinted in the debris. Caleb knelt down, his heart catching as he brushed away soot to reveal a small silver cross on a leather cord. Tomas's cross. The one he'd worn since his father gave it to him. He must have lost it when they... ... double quotes, Caleb's voice broke. He gripped the cross tightly, feeling its edges press into his palm. The simple symbol of faith stirred something deep within him, not despair, but resolve. The sound of approaching horses made them both tense. But it was Preacher Matthews leading a wagon full of townspeople. Sarah Miller from the general store. The Cooper boys. Even old Jake, who ran the livery, thought you could use some help, the preacher said simply, climbing down. Others followed, carrying buckets and boards. "We heard what happened," Sarah said, meeting Evangeline's eyes without flinching from her scar. "It ain't right what they did to that boy." The Cooper boys were already sorting through lumber. "We can have a new barn frame up before sundown, Mr. Boone." Evangeline's hands trembled as she accepted. A cup of coffee from Mrs. Matthews. These were the same people who had whispered about her, turned away from her scarred face. Now they worked alongside her, sharing water and nails, treating her like any other neighbor. "We'll find him," Caleb said quietly, showing her Tomas's cross, but not with guns blazing. "There's been enough violence." Evangeline nodded, her face lined with worry, but glowing with inner strength. "I'll go with you to face Crowder. Whatever comes, we face it together." Caleb studied her, this woman who had endured so much yet refused to break. Her scars caught the morning light, but it was her eyes that held him, bright with determination and faith. Together, he agreed, carefully tucking Tomas's cross into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. The afternoon sun beat down on the town square as Caleb guided his wagon down the dusty main street. Evangeline sat straight-backed beside him, her scarred face uncovered, while Preacher Matthews rode alongside on his dappled mare. The clip-clop of hooves drew townsfolk from shops and homes like moths to flame. "Folks," Caleb called out, his voice carrying across the growing crowd. He stood in the wagon bed, holding high the weathered packet of letters. "These papers tell a truth that needs hearing." The crowd pressed closer as Caleb began to read, his clear voice ringing off the wooden buildings. The letter spoke of promises made of water rights granted to Apache families, all properly witnessed and signed. Evangeline rose beside him, her trembling hands steadying as she added her testimony. "My father was a man of God's own heart," she declared. "He wrote these words in good faith, binding before both law and heaven." A commotion erupted at the edge of the square. Elias Croder burst through the crowd, flanked by his armed men. His face was dark with fury. "Those papers are worthless," he snarled. "This scarred woman and her Apache brat have no claim here." But the truth had already taken root. Several of Crowder's men shifted uneasily, lowering their rifles. One by one, they stepped away from their employer. "Where's the boy?" Preacher Matthews demanded, his usually gentle voice hard as iron. "Release him. Mr. Crowder, you stand alone now." The crowd murmured agreement. Even the sheriff, long in Crowder's pocket, nodded grimly. Crowder's shoulders sagged. He jerked his head toward the jail, and his remaining men brought out Tomas. The boy looked tired but unharmed. "Evangeline." Tomas cried out, breaking free and running to her. She caught him in her arms, tears streaming down her scarred cheeks as she held him close. Caleb wrapped his arms around them both, the letter still clutched in his hand, proof that truth and faith could triumph over greed and lies. The crowd pressed close, offering hands of welcome and support. Where there had once been whispers of scorn, now there were words of blessing. The truth had done its healing work. Crowder's face twisted with rage as his hand darted toward his pistol. The crowd gasped, but Caleb stepped forward, his empty hands raised. "No more violence," Caleb declared, his voice steady. "Too many have suffered already. This valley's seen enough blood." The townsfolk moved as one, forming a wall of bodies around Caleb, Evangeline, and Tomas. Even the sheriff turned his back on Crowder. Abandoned by his men and facing the united front of the community, Crowder's composure cracked. He spat a string of curses that made women cover their children's ears, then wheeled his horse and galloped away, leaving only dust and bitter words behind. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Caleb, Evangeline, and Tomas sat around their simple table. The day's victories had left them bone-weary but grateful. They shared a quiet meal of bread and stew, peace settling over them like a warm blanket. Later, under a canopy of stars, Preacher Matthews stood in the charred yard of the ranch. Neighbors gathered with lanterns, forming a circle of light. There, among the ashes of destruction, he blessed the union of Caleb and Evangeline. Their hands joined as Tomas beamed beside them. Where there had been ruin, love bloomed anew. Weeks passed, and the valley transformed under winter's first touch. The new barn stood proud against the Colorado sky, its fresh-cut timber and gleaming roof a testament to neighbors' willing hands. Inside, the sweet scent of hay mingled with leather and wood. Tomas laughed, his voice carrying across the pasture as he raced alongside the young colts. His dark eyes sparkled with joy, memories of fear fading like morning mist. The horses' hooves kicked up snow, their breath steaming in the crisp air. In the kitchen, Evangeline stirred a pot of fragrant stew, her scarred face glowing in the warmth. The door creaked open and Caleb stepped in, shaking snow from his shoulders like diamond dust. Their eyes met, hearts speaking without words. He crossed to her, drawing her close for a gentle kiss that tasted of promise and belonging, as evening settled over the ranch. Lamplight spilled golden through frost-touched windows. The three knelt together by the hearth, heads bowed in prayer. Evangeline's soft voice carried their thanks heavenward for mercy shown and family found. Caleb's strong hand rested on Tomas's shoulder, completing their circle. Outside, snow drifted silently over the peaceful valley. Justice had prevailed, and love had won its quiet victory on the frontier. Thanks for taking a moment to feel with me. If this story reminded you of what matters, hit subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow, continuing our story.